Poorvam is pleased to launch a new event series titled Cite It. In this series, we invite thinkers to discuss their papers, followed by an in-depth conversation. In this inaugural session, Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty will discuss his paper, A Cautionary Note on Motilal's Way of Doing Philosophy. Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty doesn't need any introduction, but it's my official duty to introduce him. Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty is presently the Vice-Chancellor of Presidency University and Chairman of the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, formerly Professor of Philosophy at Rabindra Bharati University. He has also been a visiting fellow at institutions such as the University of Glasgow, the University of Hyderabad, and the University of Naples, La Orientale. His research areas include philosophy of language, epistemology, philosophy of religion, and environmental ethics. His recent writings includes essays such as Transcendental, Transcendent, and Philosophical Pursuits, extending Jane Mohanty's analysis, The Challenge to Being Virtuous, Lesson from Bharat. His latest book, Three Pandits in Search of a Forgotten Scholarship, reflects his continued engagement with Indian intellectual traditions and the history of ideas. Without making any further comment and remarks, I request Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty to start his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible, right?
Yes. Yes,
okay.
You are, sir.
Yeah. So, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the editor of Poorvam and his team for organizing this talk. Today, I shall be, talking about a thinker, a philosopher who is quite well known to all of us, Professor B.K. Matilal. Like many of my contemporaries, I was initiated into classical Indian philosophy through his works. So we all owe a great debt to him, and undoubtedly, his contribution to Indian philosophy has been a continued source of inspiration to all of us. Having said that, in recent times, certain questions came to my mind about the whole approach that Matilal took when he was, presenting different questions and debates available in the classical Indian philosophical literature. And today I shall, try to, articulate some of my apprehensions about what I call Matilal model of Indian philosophy. Tirelessly and with a missionary zeal, Matilal, through his entire philosophical career, presented classical Indian philosophical debates in contemporary philosophical jargons, thereby highlighting the richness of the insights and the intensity of the effort to gain philosophical clarity that the ancient philosophical works exhibit. And Matilal has succeeded in his effort to a great extent. Matilal thought that this is the way one could integrate classical Indian philosophical insights into contemporary Western analytical tradition. Matilal concedes that the basic philosophical motivations of the classical Indians might be very different from the contemporary Anglo-American analytic philosophers. Still, some important questions and puzzles found in the classical philosophical literature, I quote, do seem to coincide to a considerable extent with those discussed today. End quote. Matilal, with great acumen, demonstrates how a dialogue could take place between the classical Nyaya, Mimamsa, and Buddhist schools on the one hand, and the Cartesian epistemologists and modern analytic philosophers on the other, in his magnum opus, Perception. Matilal thinks that Indian philosophy is an enigma to many, and he substantiates his claim with quotes from David Hume and John Locke, where both remarked about the quote unquote poor Indian philosophers who came up with absurd proposals like God creating the world like a spider, creating a cobweb out of itself, or that an elephant supporting the earth and a tortoise supporting the elephant. And this kind of attitude to Indian philosophy still persists, as it is evidenced by Antony Fliu's comment that Eastern philosophy is not concerned with arguments, and so history of philosophy records philosophical activities that took place only in Europe. Matilal felt strongly to correct this view about Indian philosophy. Too many times, Indian philosophy is presented as mystical and non argumentative, at best poetic, and at worst dogmatic. Matilal dedicates his entire philosophical career to correct these misconceptions, even at the cost of, I quote Matilal, leaning backwards. Matilal holds that even Locke himself would be surprised to note the similarity in arguments in defending certain problems of empiricist philosophy. Had he been aware of the classical texts like Abhidharma Kosha, Bhashya, or Padartha Dharma Sangraha, even the Lockean notion of substance as something where properties inhere is as old as Vaisheshika Sutra. Matilal is aware of the friendly criticism that if classical people were ultimately concerned with attaining the ultimate good, then why are these questions regarding perception, its nature and content, possibility of its failure to generate knowledge are held so important? Matilal hopes that even the questions about the nature of the ultimate good and the nature of reality lead to many specific and complicated philosophical issues. And these demand a philosophical handling. After a while, almost unconsciously, theological concerns are replaced by philosophical engagements. The intellectual history of classical India bears this out. Matilal draws our attention while contrasting Indian philosophy with Western philosophy by suggesting that some people look at Indian philosophy as overwhelmingly spiritual and so moksha oriented, and Western philosophy is materialist, this worldly, and so scientific. Over enthusiasts regarding moksha oriented nature of Indian philosophy, according to Matilal, are uninformed dreamers who think of Oriental mysticism as the solution to all the perils of modern society. People who deny Indian philosophy of the status of philosophy for its alleged mystical nature are equally uninformed, according to Matilal, of the wealth of philosophical materials available in the classical texts of Indian philosophy. Matilal concedes that Indian darshanas are moksha oriented but argues that each of the darshanas holds that attainment of moksha is preceded by knowledge of reality. And so these systems of darshanas constructed metaphysical and epistemological theories of their own that they claim would facilitate reaching the final goal of human life. This is not very different from what one can find in the classical Western philosophy as well. Besides, 400 AD onwards, Indian philosophers contributed significantly to the analysis of knowledge, theories of logic, etc. All these can be regarded as philosophical in nature, even in the modern sense of the term, Matilal holds. But could it not be that in the case of classical Indian darshanas, philosophical and logical issues were only incidental and subservient to the moksha-oriented therapeutic use of philosophy? Matilal argues that it is not true that darshanas are primarily moksha shastra. When Vatsyayana mentions Anvikshiki as a separate discipline, he specifies the topics of this branch of study as an examination of 16 categories, like means of knowledge, objects of knowledge, etc. Even if our concern for moksha gets to the back burner, the philosophical arguments available in the classical texts are at par with those available in the Western tradition. Thus, if Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant can be studied in philosophy today, why can't we study Uddotkara, Udayana, Harmakirti, and Kumarila today within the discipline of philosophy? Matilal asks. Matilal's approach to Indian philosophy is best summarized in the editorial that he wrote in the first volume of Journal of Indian Philosophy, a journal that he founded and remained its editor for next 20 years. This journal made great contribution to the development of India studies. As a policy statement, he writes, and I quote, "The field of our contributions will be bound by the limits of rational inquiry. We will avoid questions that lie in the fields of theology and mystical experience. Our method will be, in a very general sense, analytical and comparative, and we will aim at a rigorous precision in the translations of terms and statements. Our aim will be to attract professional philosophers rather than professional internationalists." End quote. From what has been presented so far, it seems clear that for Matilal, one, the model of philosophy is that which is practiced in the Anglo-American analytical tradition. Matilal's exposure to the works of Quine, Strawson, Dummett, etc., colored his interpretation of classical Indian philosophy, and he took great interest, particularly in those problems and puzzles in Indian philosophy that could be juxtaposed with their counterparts in analytic philosophy. Number two, this leads Matilal to unearth the key concepts and issues debated in the analytical tradition within the corpus of classical Indian philosophy. Western analytic philosophy becomes the yardstick for him. This generates what Matilal calls, I quote, comparative philosophy in the minimal sense. Let me comment on each of these points now. The idea of philosophy, as it is found in the Western tradition, is not a homogeneous one. Certainly, Anglo-American analytic philosophy is not the only philosophical activity that Western tradition offers. There are multiple ways of doing philosophy, even within the Western tradition. Each of these philosophical stances has its own style of writing, its own preferred set of problems and perspectives. The philosophical movements that originated and got nourished in Germany and France are very different, both in their style and problematic, from the tradition that mesmerized Matilal. Edmund Husserl's exploration of logical foundation of experience is far from where Frege talks about logic in his attempt to have a foundation of arithmetic. Even for Frege, logic does not remain content with formalization procedures. Logic in Frege turns out to be a theory of meaning, a philosophy of language, as it is understood in analytical tradition. A logician per se might not accept this Fregean use of the word logic. And so, Western philosophy is not to be equated with Anglo-American philosophy. In fact, Michael Dummett thinks that it is better to call this Anglo-Austrian and not Anglo-American philosophy for reasons he has explained. Thus, even within Western tradition, one comes across varied paradigms of philosophy, philosophical problems, and philosophical methodologies. And this is expected anyway. If philosophy, broadly speaking, is an attempt to explain human experience in all its facets, then different people could be expected to philosophize in different ways. And these philosophical trajectories move in different directions. Taking one of these as the philosophy and then trying to shape all other philosophical activities following this proper philosophy, so to say, is misleading at best and authoritarian at worst. If Husserlian logic and Fregean logic can coexist, then why can't Western logic and Indian logic? Any attempt to interpret Indian logic in terms of the Western logical problems and vocabularies would actually reinforce the claim that logic proper is Western in its origin. If it is true, as Matilal formulates, that relativism moves ahead of pluralism in claiming that alternative concepts are equally valid and that there is no overarching standard to evaluate each of the individual claims, then one could very well be a relativist with regard to various conceptions of logic. And relativist in this sense could well be an orthodox. An orthodox undergoes three stages in her life. One, she accepts whatever is given, sometimes through family, sometimes through society, education, etc. Two, she constantly evaluates the received data, resulting in reformulation, accepting or rejecting that has been received. Three, finally, the orthodox rests herself either on the old view that has been received, or she might accept the new view after the conversion takes place. The fanatic does not undergo these stages. Thus, sorry.
Can you please mute yourself, guys, everybody? Sorry, Professor. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So shall I go ahead?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
please. Yes.
Okay. The fanatic does not undergo these stages. Thus, if an orthodox leaves open the possibility of conversion and still wants to hold on to her views, then an Indian logician might appreciate the logic in Western sense and yet stick to her Indian logic that she has received from the indigenous system of education. And then the attempt to reorient Indian logic following Western logical vocabulary and problematic does not seem to be a desideratum. 2 points stand out in the Indian theory of inference, having 5 syllogistic members, what is usually known as Panchavayava Anumana. First, the entire account is given in terms of mental events that take place in the mind of the interlocutor. The internal consistency of the inferential process is guided by the norms of cognitive psychology. Second, this whole inferential process is taking place against the background of a dialogical context where one person tries to convince the other of the desired conclusion. The inferential process aims at proving something to the other person. This process was often followed in the cases of disputes or debates. It is quite clear that Indian theory of inference is heavily couched in psychological terms. It is also evident that the account of inference that is found in Indian philosophy is different in a significant sense from that one can find in Western logic. Acknowledging this distinctive feature of Indian logic, can one label Indian logic as psychologistic? This is the question that has been raised and discussed by many contemporary Indian philosophers, including Matilal. A reconstruction of Indian theory of inference, a la J.N. Mohanty, could be of help here. In this interpretation, we are talking about inference in terms of mental events. But here, a mental event exemplifies a universal structure in the sense that two mental events can illustrate the same structure. When we talk of mental event or act, there is always a reference to a self where that mental act or event occurs. And of course, it has a temporal reference. There is a particular point in time when the mental event or act takes place. But we can also talk about the act nature. And by act nature, this is the term that Mohanty uses. I think Mohanty picks up this from Husserl's logical investigations. And by act nature, I mean the act could be perception or memory, etc. And last but not least, there is the content of the act. This content is clearly not the object lying there outside in the world. It is best understood as the intended object of the mental act. Now, the structure of the content may change according to how the external object is presented in the act. In the example, Nilo Ghataha, this is a blue jar. The primary object is jar and blue color is the qualifier. In the example, Ghatasya Nilam, the blue of the jar, the primary object is the blue color and which is perceived as belonging to a jar. They float in the structure of the content of that knowledge. These entities and their structure are universal in the sense that many cognitive acts or events may illustrate the same structure. In Indian theory of inference, we can be said to deal with this structure of a cognitive act that is universal. On this account, two cognitive acts can be said to be identical if they have the same act nature and exemplify the same content structure. Viewed this way, the reference to the owner of the mental act and the time when the act takes place are irrelevant. Here, we are giving an account of knowledge in terms of mental act, but it does not land us in the realm of the subjective that the anti-psychologistic philosophers thought it would. Thus, one can very well argue that Indian logic, Indian theory of inference, especially Panchavaya Anumana, does involve the idea of the mental, but nonetheless, it does not lead to psychologism in the sense in which it has been used in Western logic. In the light of the above account, we can now look at the ideas of necessity and contingency in Indian logic. Usually, logical truths are treated as necessary truths. They are true by virtue of their forms. They are analytic. Factual truths are contingent. They are true by virtue of what happens in the world. Setting aside the question whether this distinction between necessary and contingent truth is ultimately tenable, because this is the question that has been raised by Quine very significantly. In the present context, the more significant query concerns the presence or absence of the idea of necessity in Indian logic. If Indian theory of inference is formulated in terms of mental acts, then can we talk of logical necessity in Western philosophical sense? One could talk of different kinds of necessity. One, logical necessity. Two, essential necessity. And three, causal necessity. Logical necessity is the necessity that could be said to hold between sentence forms. This is the kind of necessity that we find obtaining among different propositions of logic in Western philosophical tradition. Essential necessity is expressed in the laws that are grounded on the essences of the things concerned. If one accepts this kind of necessity, then these laws are necessary. One could also talk of causal necessity, where the relation holds between cause and effect. From the above presentation of Indian theory of inference, it is natural to conclude that this theory involves the idea of causal necessity. In Indian formulation of inferential process, causal necessity can be said to hold between the sequences of mental episodes leading to the conclusion of the inference. In Indian formulation, the structure of inference for other, or artha anumana, is presented in such a manner that the cognitive episodes expressed in the corresponding sentences do exhibit a causal structure where each mental act is bound to produce the following mental act provided the required conditions are fulfilled. The important question that we face here is, can we ascribe non-causal necessity to Indian theory of inference? One problem that arises immediately following ascription of logical necessity to Indian theory of inference is that logical necessity is said to hold between propositions, and Indian logic lacks any such concept. Instead, what we find in Indian theory of inference is the division between inference for oneself, swartha anumana, and inference for other, parartha anumana. In inference for oneself, inferential process involves internal mechanism where one cognitive episode is necessarily followed by another. In the case of inference for another, parartha anumana, the external mechanism is expressed in terms of sentences or utterances of them, where each of these sentences or utterances is necessarily followed by another. This leads Matilal to suggest that in the internal case, in the Swartha Anumana, I quote Matilal, logic appears to be psychologized, while in the second, that means in Parartha Anumana, it is linguisticized. This is from Matilal. And he further claims that in either case, causal necessity is superimposed on what is called logical necessity. Matilal's argument for ascribing logical necessity to Indian theory of inference is that when it is said that if A is a sign or linga of B, and if we assert A of something, we must assert B of it. Internally, it is viewed as a causal sequence of mental cognitive events like seeing A in a particular case combined with another cognitive episode of remembering that A is the sign of B, etc., etc. The combination of these episodes is called paramarsha. And it is said that if there is paramarsha, then the conclusion will necessarily follow. This causally necessary consequence is also a logically necessary consequence, according to Matilal, for to the question what would happen if the person gets distracted or falls asleep immediately after the appearance of paramarsha, the answer would be that though the concluding cognitive episode would not follow, this psychological contingency would not undermine the logical necessity of the conclusion that follows from the prior cognitive episodes. The failure of the conclusion to appear is due to some non-logical factors. Even in the external mechanism of inference, when it is said that the sign, vyapya, is there, the signified vyapaka is necessarily there, the principle is couched in non-psychologistic terms. It is true that we identify a sign as a logical sign, i.e. sign that warrants inference through empirical method, but then a sign is thus identified only if its presence necessarily signifies the presence of the signified, thus concludes Matilal. There could be several responses to Matilal's attempt to find logical necessity in Indian logic. First, one could suggest that there is hardly any opposition between causal and logical necessity. In inference for oneself, we find causally necessary connection, and in the inference for other, we find logically necessary connection, and these are just two sides of the same coin. Viewed this way, the charge against psychologism gets rather weak because there remains no unbridgeable gap between the psychological and the logical. One could move further and claim that the idea of logical necessity can be derived from that of psychological necessity. Psychological necessity is the fundamental one on which other kinds of necessities rest. One might go on claiming like this. If one makes a distinction between source and justification of necessity, one could very well claim that if we think of the source of necessity, then we will fall back on psychological necessity. But if we are interested in the justification of necessity, then we can think in terms of logical necessity, for it is in logic that we take up justificatory questions regarding our inferential knowledge. Matilal seems to me is siding with the claim that logical necessity gives rise to psychological necessity, and Matilal cites evidence for this claim from Indian theory of inference, especially that of Nyaya and Buddhism. Let me toy with a rather radical idea, namely, psychological necessity is all that is there. If this is acceptable, then the very motive behind Matilal's attempt to find logical necessity behind the talk of psychological necessity in Indian theory of inference might seem to be wrong-headed. Let us take a close look at the use of the word necessarily in our language, preferably English. If people thought that almost everything that happened in the world happened by necessity, or if people thought almost nothing in the world happened by necessity, then we would have little occasion to use the word necessarily. Often we use necessarily to talk about future events, like if a polluting industry is built here, then the local inhabitants are bound to be hostile, meaning thereby that they will be necessarily hostile. We use words like bound to, surely, must as synonymous with necessarily. We use these necessity idioms also to talk about the past and present. Like, as a chief minister, she must have enriched herself, meaning necessarily did. For look at her earlier record as an, say, member of assembly. Notice that we use the word necessarily or its synonyms where we are less than sure of the facts. When we are sure, we just affirm without any intensity. This is indeed paradoxical. But then necessarily, the term necessarily is not always a rhetorical device to cover up our uncertainty. When somebody is told, while looking at a leopard in a jungle, necessarily it will have spots, other than viewing it as a prediction, this utterance could also be viewed as a conditional sentence of the form, if it is a leopard, it has spots. Here, there is no rhetoric involved. All these examples show that necessity is a matter of connection between facts, and it is not concerned with facts taken separately. Now, what does make connection a necessary one? To take the example of leopard, when the arrival of some leopard is announced, we expect an animal with spots. What is the connection? We have the knowledge of the general truth that all leopards have spots. The only answer to the question why the newly arrived leopard should have spots is that all leopards have spots. One can take more complicated examples, but I guess the answer would be the same. One must not interpret it claiming that a person is entitled to apply necessarily as long as she thinks that there is some general truth that subsumes the present one. This would make it possible to use necessarily to everything, and the term would lose its significance. What is important is that the person has some actual generalization in her mind, and that she thinks subsumes the present one, and whose truth is independent of the particular case in hand. 2 points stand out from this discussion. First, the word necessarily applies not to particular events or states, rather to whole conditional connections. Second, the application of necessarily requires an allusion to some generality that subsumes the present one. One of the cases where the term necessarily comes under close scrutiny is the case where we explain the dispositional terms like soluble. To claim of a particular lump of stuff that it is soluble is to claim more than that, whenever it is in water, it dissolves. For that particular lump could never be in water. For a lump to be soluble, we must be able to claim that if it were in water, then it would dissolve. Clearly, what we need here is an if-then formulation guided by necessity. With the knowledge gained from chemistry that gives us the details of the sub-microscopic structure of the lump concerned, we equate these explanatory traits with solubility. What is true of the dispositional terms like solubility could very well be true of subjunctive conditionals like if X were treated like this, then it would do so and so. One could also come up with a set of explanatory traits, sometimes with the help of an expert, to explain the conditional. These conditional sentences may or may not contain the adverb, may not contain the term necessarily explicitly. Nonetheless, the subjunctive form connotes it. The point worth noting here is that the necessity constructions rest on generality, and the generality can be explained in terms of certain traits that the relevant theory can tell us. How is one going to explain what is called logical or mathematical necessity? These varieties of truths are called necessary because they are true by definition. Imagine a physicist is confronted with an experimental finding that goes against her professed theory. She has to change her theory at some point to inactivate the false prediction. And the normal practice in scientific community is to modify or change the relevant concepts in such a manner that the apparently false prediction can well be accommodated within the theory. The definitions are not something sacrosanct that they can never be altered. They are also susceptible to changes like other sentences. As theoretical and experimental physics do have the same content and differ in motivation and application, so also pure mathematics dealing with logico-mathematical truths and physics differ only in motivation but not in their content. If this is true, then logical necessity is stripped of its privileged status, and the only necessity that one can talk about is the necessity resting on generalization, which in its turn is explicable in terms of empirical traits. So the real burden that the idea of necessity is to bear is shouldered by empirical necessity. Empirical necessity is all that we need in order to have science, including Indian theory of inference. When this empirical necessity gets floated in knowledge, what we get is necessity among the different cognitive episodes. And this is precisely what we have in Indian formulation of inferential knowledge. Let us not split our hair in trying to find out the idea of logical necessity in Indian logic. What I find uncomfortable in Matilal's way of doing comparative philosophy is the attempt to excavate the Indian counterparts of Western tradition. As a student of Indian philosophy, what is more natural to me is to understand Western philosophical insights in terms of that which are available in Indian philosophical tradition. And it might quite so happen that certain questions are never raised, or that the formulation of certain questions are very different in Indian philosophical tradition. While analyzing the Vyapti relation, one could see that the distinction between necessary truths and contingent truths is not maintained, and so the analytic synthetic distinction seems to be foreign to Indian logic. Consequent to this are the ideas of universal that are graspable through senses, and the absence of the distinction between formal truth and material truth. And none of these ideas are available in Western philosophical thinking. This does not make Indian philosophy more philosophical than its Western counterpart. As students of philosophy, we are not obligated to combine all the different paths into a single highway. Each philosophical development is a result of the historic dynamics that is peculiar to it. The long and rich commentatorial tradition of classical Indian philosophy shows how philosophical ideas developed by understanding, reformulating, and sometimes rejecting the predecessor's views. I am afraid Matilal would not accept the proposition that Indian philosophy is essentially spiritual. For Matilal, this is a misleading description which is at the root of many other false ideas about Indian philosophy. The word spiritual in Indian philosophy could mean one, Indian philosophical insight thoughts themselves are spiritual. Two, the subject matter of this discourse is spiritual. Three, acts of thinking whose products are thoughts are spiritual. Four, philosophical thinking leads up to a goal which is spiritual. Five, one central task of philosophical thinking is to show the possibility of attaining such a spiritual goal. The first sense is useless. For if thoughts are spiritual, then all thoughts are so, and not only Indian philosophical thoughts. Second sense is partially true, for Indian philosophical systems do talk about spiritual entities like Atman, etc. If the question about Atman is divided into several sub-questions, as has been done in Indian philosophical systems, like Atman is individuated, or is it one entity present in all sentient beings, or is consciousness an intrinsic property of Atman, or is Atman different from the psychophysical complex called body, etc., then it becomes fuzzy to determine which one of these questions is identical with the question, is Atman spiritual? In second and third senses, Indian philosophy is spiritual. But then these are philosophically uninteresting claims, and they fail to show why Indian philosophy is different from Western philosophy, a task for which they were called. Indian philosophy can be called spiritual in the sense of 4 and 5. It must, however, be noted here that even the most conservative of the Indian philosophers would not claim that there is a cause-effect relation between philosophy and attainment of the highest end, namely moksha, which is spiritual in nature. The Upanishadic three-tier means of attaining the knowledge of Atman should not be forgotten. The first stage is Shravana, where the relevant texts are to be studied under a teacher. Then comes Manana, where philosophical reflection is carried out on what is learned. Here one is supposed to find arguments in support of a thesis, and he is supposed to find arguments by which the impossibility of a proposition can be removed. The next stage is Nididhyasana, where meditation on the thesis proved is performed. The tortuous intellectual process ends with Manana, and the path after Manana till moksha through Nididhyasana is something that is beyond the scope of philosophy. So even if we accept that Indian philosophy is spiritual, in the sense we are discussing now, philosophy is never regarded as the cause of moksha. And it is too well known to mention that the persons without any philosophical sophistication have allegedly attained moksha by some other extraordinary means. What at best could be said is that one central function of Indian philosophy is to determine the possibility of the highest goal in human life, namely moksha, which certainly is spiritual in nature. But then the alleged description of Indian philosophy as spiritual loses much of its point. For philosophical speculation about something spiritual in nature can very well be found in Western philosophical tradition, and this does not make Western philosophical pursuit any less philosophical in nature. When K.C. Bhattacharya analyzes three stages of subjectivity He talks about bodily subjectivity, psychic subjectivity, and spiritual subjectivity. These three belong to cognitive, volitional, and affective states of subjectivity. Spiritual subjectivity is best manifest in the feeling aspect. Feeling is completely subject dependent. Feeling, qua feeling, is not object directed. Feeling is self referential. In this stage, according to K.C. Bhattacharya, subject completely frees itself from the clutches of the limit of the natural world. This is why the subjectivity best expresses itself in this stage. Subjectivity in its pristine purity can be found in this stage. One could explain the different features of spiritual subjectivity in great detail as K.C. Bhattacharya has done. And this has nothing to do with mysticism that Matilal is so apprehensive of while describing Indian philosophy as spiritual in nature. When Nyaya talks about the ultimate good, Nishreyasa, being attainable, following the knowledge of the 16 categories or padarthas, it is to be noted that each of the disciplines like agriculture, Varta, politics, Dandaniti, etc., has their own realm of theoretical knowledge. And each of the disciplines has got its own idea of ultimate good. So Nishreyasa does not necessarily mean moksha. Each of these disciplines, namely politics, namely agriculture and commerce, has also their own Nishreyasa, has also got their own Tattvajnana. But all the other disciplines somehow depend on knowledge of means of knowledge, pramana, which is the subject matter of Nyaya. Without a proper knowledge of the nature, justification, and varieties of ways of knowing, one cannot expect to have a proper knowledge of subject matters that are discussed in these individual disciplines like Varta and Dandaniti. Nyaya seems to be a meta-level study of the nature, scope, and validity of argument. And this meta-level knowledge is required to study the arguments specific to the individual disciplines. So the ultimate good that various disciplines talk about or aim at are parasitic on the idea of the ultimate good that Nyaya aims at. If my interpretation of spiritual, as done in the above paragraphs, is acceptable, then I don't see any problem in claiming that Nyaya, because of its holding the ultimate good as the summum bonum, is spiritual. If one follows Kalidas Bhattacharya's interpretation of Indian philosophy, then one is led to the conclusion that, and I quote, creative thought in India ended with Udayana in the 10th century. By creative thought, Bhattacharya, meaning Kalidas Bhattacharya, means serious grappling with the problems of life and existence as distinct from formalistic clarifications of conclusions already arrived at. Not that analysis, proof, refutation were not present there, but they were never taken as ends in themselves. Even without entering into any debate regarding the validity of Bhattacharya's comment, I think that this is an alternative way of looking at Indian philosophy with which Matilal might not agree. Nonetheless, this is an alternative view that deserves to be taken seriously. Are philosophy and mysticism opposed to each other? Well, it all depends on how one looks at it. One could, and there is actually such a literature, analyze mysticism and talk philosophically about the claims of mysticism. One could construct a theory of meaning of the sentences uttered by mystics. As one could talk philosophically about God without being either a believer or a non-believer, one could similarly talk about mysticism without practicing mysticism. One need not be alarmed with the mere presence of the word mysticism. And I think Matilal has, has expressed this kind of disapproval whenever this word mysticism comes up. The original motive of philosophical pursuit, be it either in East or in West, was to unravel the mysteries of life and world. And part of this pursuit was to understand human life in its various facets. Philosophers of antiquity thought that life in its present state is fraught with various inadequacies. So they started talking about an ideal state of human existence and the ways to attain that state. Socrates declares that, and I quote, of all investigations, this is the noblest. What sort of man should one be, and what should one practice, and up to what point when he is young and when he is old? End quote. Similarly, the Upanishadic quest for the understanding of the nature of self leads many of the classical Indian philosophers to set an emancipatory goal before humans. And of course, philosophical justifications ensue. If moksha orientedness of Indian philosophy degenerates it into mysticism, then Socrates would meet the same fate. And any student of philosophy would agree that this is farthest from truth. One need not be apologetic about Indian philosophy. One need not engage in a selective interpretation of either Indian or Western philosophy in the name of comparative study. Let us not delude ourselves in competitive comparative studies of Indian and Western philosophy. The sky would not have fallen if Sriharsha did not meet Gettier. And one of the sections in Bimal Matilal's book Perception is called Sriharsha Meets Gettier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. It's such a really bold claim that you have made in your paper. But I am just wondering, do you consider this comparative model of philosophy which Motilal is pursuing can be the base of today's fusion philosophy? I mean, is this? I mean, this structure of comparative philosophy, does it kind of entail today's fusion philosophy, the hybrid philosophy that we are practicing?
Yeah, I think in the present, academic setup, since we are exposed both to classical Indian philosophical thinking and also Western philosophical thoughts, ideas. So in a way, comparative philosophy is inevitable. But the point that I would like to raise, especially with regard to my understanding of Matilal, is comparative philosophy does not necessarily imply that we have to sort of find out the presence of the concepts or debates available in one tradition, okay, in another tradition with which we are comparing. Rather, it might be philosophically quite interesting project to find out what are the lacks. Why, for example, to give you a complete example, why this analytic synthetic distinction that was so dominant in Western philosophy, okay, for centuries, why is it absent in classical Indian philosophical tradition, okay, and how do Indian philosophers sort of address the relevant issues without falling back on the analytic synthetic distinction? This I think would be a more fruitful project, philosophically speaking, rather than trying to find out the analytic synthetic distinction, okay, in say for example in Nyaya.
Yeah, true, yeah. Do you think that Motilal is constantly kind of asking for a colonial validation?
Well, this this book called Perception, which is, definitely, one of the greatest works on Indian philosophy in our time. He dedicated this book to Strawson and Dummett,
Yeah.
with the hope that the Western analytical philosophers would really engage with some of the debates, some of the ideas found in classical Indian philosophy. But I'm not sure whether this Matilal's project has yielded the desired result. So
true. But this constant urge of validation was there. I mean, it was kind of very clear throughout your talk that Motilal always kind of seeking for that validation, or try, his the central idea of his comparative philosophy is Anglo-American philosophy.
Right,
so
right.
there's
No,
a constant urge for validation.
Right. No, I could see why Matilal is so passionate about this, because when he went abroad to do his research on Indian philosophy, it was I am sure that he faced a lot of hurdles. Okay, he had to face a lot of adverse comments about Indian philosophy. So I could see the motive, and I could see why Matilal was so passionate. And in almost all his books, I mean, at least the early ones, okay, everywhere wherever he was talking, he was bringing in different concepts, different theories from Sannyaya, from Mimamsa, from Buddhism. Constantly he is referring to the corresponding debates and concepts in analytical philosophy. Because that brand of philosophy, I think he was exposed to primarily. Okay. But another point I would like to mention, I mean, Western philosophy is not just Anglo-American analytic philosophy. This also we must bear in mind. So there are alternative approaches, and which Mohanty actually does it brilliantly. He brings in Husserl, he brings in different theories of classical Indian epistemologies, and he also he also sort of appropriates many of these insights, many of these ideas in his handling of both Indian and Western philosophy.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chakraborty. I request participants who are willing to question Professor Chakraborty, please unmute, and you can ask Professor Chakraborty directly. If anybody has any question, please unmute yourself and ask Professor Chakraborty.
Hand raised. Can you please switch on your video, Parthiban?
Yeah, please unmute yourself and ask Professor Chakraborty.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Parthiban from University of
Parthiban,
Nilambar.
Please, yeah. So we cannot see you, Parthiban. Probably I'm seeing you after a long time.
I prefer if I can just use my audio, if you guys don't mind. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. Some are like exploratory. One is clarificatory. If I may, should I just go ahead and list out my questions?
Yeah. Yes.
So firstly, I'd like further clarification on this. This I'm quoting you. This came towards the end when you said, if moksha orientedness of Indian philosophy degenerates into mysticism, then Socrates would meet the same fate. I'm quoting. Could you? I sense that you're presenting an argument here, but I am not. So I would like you to clarify or expand on the argument that you're presenting here with regards to. I know you're comparing it with the previous quotation of Socrates of pursuit of good, but I'm not clear on the argument that you're actually, or the comparison you're presenting. If you could expound on it further, that's my first question.
Okay.
Secondly, you mentioned the analytic synthetic divide. Obviously, I mean, one way in which it is emphasized or understood in history of Western philosophy is because of Hume's distinction, that he wants to bring this emphasize analytic synthetic distinction, whether it existed before or not, that in order to show why only kind of to do away with things like ghosts and stuff. That is, there. I mean, he says that right in the introduction of his one of his main books that they are only mathematical things, and then you should do away with anything which is not empirical. So there are only two kinds. So that probably seems to be the motivation for the analytical synthetic divide or its centrality, uh, which probably was not there in most of it. Maybe if Charvaka philosophers existed, I mean, much later than they did, probably we would have also come up with something like that. But anyway, that is not my question. I just thought because you raised that question. But my question here is the interpretation of the two dogmas of empiricism, Quine. The another way of interpret is you need not have the analytical synthetic division. It can all be just empirical. But another way of another interpretation is it could also be just purely analytical or purely empirical. That is, there is no you can talk of these questions in purely analytical terms. Then, if that interpretation, if we take it and we choose analytical, then it would become that causal necessity can also be spoken in terms of logical necessity. So, the same argument can be used to say that there is logical necessity in Indian philosophy or in that thing, and causal necessity can be reduced to that because it works the other way around also, at least to some interpretations of Quine's uh, attack on the synthetic analytic. That is the exploratory question I have. If I may ask a third question,
Yes,
can I
please,
go ahead?
please.
Yeah. So you I didn't understand how you think that that argument of falling asleep, where actually the Matilal talks about falling asleep and how even if psychological that there is causative thing and it doesn't happen, the conclusion mental state does not appear, right? So in a sense, the causal chain fails there, right? Now, why is that not an argument? I didn't understand why that is not a very um, what do you say, strong argument for logical necessity being implied and causal necessity being something which is even if does not happen or something which is seems to be secondary in a sense. So if you probably you had a argument, but I didn't come across there. So why you have not refuted that example? That because it presents a very strong argument, in my opinion. So that's my three questions. Thank you.
Thanks. So can I answer
Yeah,
these, Nilambar?
yeah. Go ahead, please. Yeah. After that,
Okay.
we will come to Shreya and Professor Upal Chakraborty.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. The reason I made this comment about I mean quoted from one of the dialogues of Plato, where Socrates is very much concerned with one of the fundamental questions that philosophy is supposed to address about the ideal nature of human life. And similarly, Indian philosophers, in some way or other, do talk about, some kind of, ultimate summum bonum of human life. You can call it moksha, you can call it nirvana, you can call it nishriyas, whatever. So the reason why I brought in is this, that uh, one of the reasons Matilal thinks why Indian philosophy is often considered as spiritual, mystical, okay, non-argumentative, etc., is because of its emphasis on this idea of moksha, okay, because of its orientation to this ideal existence, ideal human existence. Now, I would like to argue that this can't be the reason why, Indian philosophy could be regarded as less philosophical, compared to the nature of the Western philosophical pursuit. Okay, so if you call Indian philosophy mystical, etc., because of its moksha orientation, then this quotation from Socrates, from Plato's Dialogues, would also suggest that, well, Socrates is concerned with how the ideal human life could be achieved, etc. So this is not a fair criticism of Indian philosophy being spiritual because of its moksha orientation. About this analytic synthetic distinction and the other question regarding causal necessity, etc. I can club these together because they are related to each other. Matilal tries to argue that even in the Indian theory of inference, one could find the trace of logical necessity. And Matilal does this because he wants to show that Indian logic is no less logical in nature than Western logic, because even in Indian logic, we do have the idea of logical necessity. Okay, because logical necessity, is one of the foundational ideas in Western formal logic. And he sort of tries to do that in terms of Swartha Anumana and Parartha Anumana, and also that is where he brings in this idea of falling asleep, as we were talking about, that these mental episodes, okay, which necessarily follow one another. Okay, now after Paramarsha, immediately after Paramarsha, we are not getting into a detailed analysis of these 5 steps of Indian theory of syllogism. Okay, so they immediately after Paramarsha, the final conclusion necessarily follows. Now, what would happen if because this entire interpretation is given in terms of mental episodes, given in terms of mental acts of the person who is inferring. So after the penultimate stage, that means after Paramarsha, if the person gets distracted, or or something happens to that person, would the conclusion necessarily follow? This is the question. Okay, Matilal seems to suggest that, well, insofar as mental episodes are concerned, insofar as understanding the 5-membered syllogism in terms of mental episodes, the ultimate mental episode would not appear because the person has got distracted or whatever. Okay, but still necessarily, I mean, in the conceptual sense, in the logical sense, the conclusion would be there, even if the person who was undergoing the inferential process would not have that episode. So this was the reason why Matilal was trying to bring in the idea of logical necessity in Indian theory of inference, despite the fact that Indian theory of inference is presented in terms of mental events or acts. And insofar as this analytic synthetic distinction is concerned, I think the primary motive behind introducing this distinction in the Western philosophical tradition is to suggest that there are certain truths which are truths about the world, and there are certain truths which are truths about language. Okay. Now, without getting into the Quinian presentation of this problem and his criticism, and I think this binary of truths about language and truths about world is not accepted in the Indian philosophical tradition, and they have their own way of interpreting the nature of understanding the analytic statements and also the synthetic statements. So it is interesting to see how especially the Nayayikas, okay, they sort of offer an interpretation of understanding, Shabdabodha, of the analytic and the synthetic statements without falling back on the distinction between analytic and synthetic.
Yeah. Shreya, could you please turn on your camera? Hi, Shreya, are you there?
Hi.
Hi. Could you please turn on your camera? And
Yes. I'm not able to do that, but
okay. Yeah. Please go ahead if you're unable to do that. Shreya, please go ahead, please.
okay. So,
You don't have
hi,
to
sir.
turn on
Thank
your
you for your
camera. Yeah.
talk. Yeah. So, thank you for your talk. I am Neha from IIT Tirupati. So, uh, so I the one of I'm quoting you in that paper. You said that you find very uncomfortable in Mathila's reading the idea that he is trying to dig out like the Indian counterparts within Western tradition.
Just interrupting once.
So,
There is a
so
noise in your background. Can you?
is it?
We can hear that there is a noise in your background.
Hello.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead, please.
I guess she is rejoining in some time. We can take Professor
Okay. We
Chakraborty's
can take
question.
Professor Chakraborty's question. Yeah. After that, we'll take Shreya's question. Professor Chakraborty.
Hello, sir. Thank you
Yes,
for
please.
very interesting presentation. I was thinking about a few things.
Yeah.
Let me try to articulate them. I see a kind of critique of, let's say, a type of comparativism which is there in Motilal. And my question is, in rounding off that critique and in pointing out, let's say, a method of finding lacks and gaps, do you return to a different comparativism, or you kind of question the very idea of comparativism itself? And in relation to that, I would also like to ask you whether you think, what you think is the relation between pluralism and comparativism. And finally, one little question about if I could ask you to, let's say, situate your position, the one that you are taking now, in terms of, let's say, a certain history of doing comparativism in Indian philosophy. I'm, let's say, reminded of particularly, this essay by Ganeri on KCB, where he characterizes KCB's framework as an immersive cosmopolitanism. And in characterizing that framework as such, he talks about this discussion on KCB, which happened in the 1980s in one of the central major journals of Indian philosophy, where KCB's position was shunned by a lot of important Indian philosophers at that time as kind of conservative. Okay. And Ganeri kind of rehabilitates, he goes through that discussion and he rehabilitates KCB by showing how there is an inward yet cosmopolitan and immersive cosmopolitanism in KCB. So since you used KCB today while making a critique of Motilal, and you are at the same time also making a critique of comparativism of a kind, how would you characterize your position in the history of the kind of comparativism, let's say, that has been done by 20th century Indian philosophers who have been working in a context of colonialism and nationalism? They have been aware of, the historical forces which are defining their framework. So they are aware of the kind of, let's say, hegemony that their comparativism is under, and therefore they are also trying to, let's say, to some extent decolonize their comparativism from that hegemony. Given this history, and given the fact that today you seem to be making a critique of comparativism, how would you locate your own position with respect to this history? This is something I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, these are the questions that I really keep on asking myself as well. Look at the history of the commentatorial tradition of Indian philosophy. Comparative philosophy is nothing new. Each, commentator, okay, addresses the issues raised by his predecessor while responding to other philosophical systems or schools. Okay, so any Sanskrit philosophical text is full of attempts to reformulate, to address, sometimes even to sort of reorganize the thoughts, the ideas, the definitions of his predecessors, or in the face of several objections, several questions raised by other schools of philosophy. So comparative philosophy in that sense, since the Indian system, the Indian tradition was basically primarily a Vada system of philosophy and an argumentative tradition. So comparative philosophy in that sense, is nothing new. And you can also see how the problems, how the questions are being reformulated, how the particular definitions, okay, are reformulated in the face of a long tradition of disputes and debates. So the philosophical specific philosophical theories, concepts, debates, they come with a baggage. They just don't fall from sky, right? Okay. Now, so each system of classical Indian philosophy, any system, I mean, take Nyaya, take Buddhism, take Mimamsa, etc., each system has, through its tradition, through its commentaries, has developed a kind of whole repertoire of debates, concepts, definitions, etc., through ages. Now, when we talk of comparative philosophy, where European and American philosophical ideas sort of enter into our philosophical space, that is something qualitatively different. I mean, I don't want to go to the extreme that no comparison is possible. I'm not claiming that, but I'm more cautious about this whole attempt at comparative philosophy, and the apprehensions that I have formulated, that I have with regard to Matilal's approach is this, that perhaps it is not philosophically sort of worthwhile, or to try to find corresponding ideas in different philosophical traditions. Okay, a lot of people, I'm sure you remember that at one point, a lot of people, talk about comparing Shankara with, Hegel, or Hegel's British student Bradley. Okay. Now, I am not really, I mean, with due respect to all of them, I'm not really very enthusiastic about these kinds of projects. I'm not sure, because when you talk about Hegel's philosophical, findings, I mean, it has its own tradition. It has its own baggage that he carries. And there are certain problems, there are certain debates that he wants to engage with. Now, Shankara has a completely different, philosophical sort of inheritance, which he wants to engage with. So I'm not sure whether these kinds of comparisons, and I must also acknowledge that Matilal was aware of this. Matilal was very much aware of this. So he was very cautious when he was talking about, when he was using this word comparative philosophy. I think he says comparative philosophy in a minimal sense. That is his expression. I mean, my position is, I'm not against comparativism per se. Okay, I am more a cautious comparativist. And since you have mentioned K.C. Bhattacharya's name, I think that K.C. Bhattacharya's model is more fruitful, more philosophically sort of rewarding, because when he talks about Kant, he doesn't talk about ideas which are present in Kant and tries to find the corresponding ideas in Indian tradition. Okay, so his cosmopolitanism is more inclusive. More inclusive in the sense that he appropriates ideas of Kant, his understanding of Vedanta, because some people might not agree with his understanding of Vedanta, right? So all sorts of things, and then something new emerges, which is K.C. Bhattacharya's own kind of philosophical contribution. So that is the kind of comparativism that I sort of admire, and I aspire after. So comparativism in that sense, I am sympathetic to.
Yes, Rhea. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, sir.
Yeah.
So yeah, my question was actually a continuation with Professor Chakraborty. Yes. So so as I was mentioning, so in this paper you wrote like that you were uncomfortable with Matilal's idea, like Matilal's way of finding out Indian counterparts within Western tradition. So yeah, that is like his way of doing like a comparative philosophy, and the historical need you also mentioned, like he went abroad and like that. But now I want to like understand like how should we do comparative philosophy now, like in historically. So yeah, you already mentioned, and like elements I want to know, like like in Matilas we see like he is particularly interested in analytical philosophy, like Nyaya. He is like showing the concepts, that how these like the concepts are present, and the way of approaching the concepts. But we hardly see any like socio-political parallel of this comparative philosophy. So when we are talking about comparative philosophy, it's actually, I like whatever I read, I just see like it's mainly remained only like in terms of analytical portion. But what do you think? Like first, so my question is first that what should be the historical need right now for doing comparative philosophy, knowing the fact that we are aware that how colonial effects distorted Indian philosophy, and now the project itself, like that decolonization project itself took another turn that is more right-wing turn kind of we see. How to like deal with that, and how to uh, like how do you define historical need right now for doing comparative philosophy? First question. And the second is what should be the elements each of like extending, like extending this method of philosophy in terms of like different elements rather than only analytical part. And yes, yeah, this two clarificatory questions actually.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Shreya. You know, I mean, given the uh, academic philosophical setup that we all are working with, okay, uh, uh, comparative philosophy in some sense is inevitable. We really can't shut our eyes, okay, and pretend that what has happened in this Indian soil is the ultimate truth, and we don't need to talk about or get exposed to other ideas. That's certainly the last thing that we should do, okay. So in that sense, we and also, I mean, if you look at the curriculum in our Indian universities, there are, both, texts from Indian philosophy and also, of course, Western philosophers. So we are sort of more or less, are acquainted with the different ideas, different thoughts, different theories of both classical Indian philosophy and Western philosophy. At the same time, as you very correctly mentioned, that it is of course not a fault of Matilal, because he came from the Sanskrit tradition. Okay, he was basically a Sanskrit scholar. He was trained in Nyaya by some of the great Nyaya scholars of Calcutta. Then he went abroad. He took great pain in attending the classes of Quine at Harvard. He studied quite a bit of logic and analytic philosophy there. So it is really remarkable that from his Sanskrit scholarship background, he sort of engaged with these analytical philosophical ideas. But at the same time, I mean, there are, other than beyond this analytical tradition, there are many other philosophers who have made significant contributions to different areas of philosophy, and that we are now, I think, thanks to our exposure, we are getting those people, we are getting to know their contribution, their philosophical ideas. So we must broaden, so to say, our intellectual interest, okay, and engage with many of the ideas of these philosophers who have sort of made significant contribution to the different social and political thoughts, okay. So this is something I'm sure that there are people who are doing it, maybe not from mainstream philosophy, maybe from other disciplines, but we, as academic philosophers, as professional philosophers, we must be acquainted and address some of those ideas, thoughts coming from other philosophical traditions. I mean, other than analytic philosophy. So this is something we should do. And I'm not, as I'm suggesting, that I'm not, I mean, by raising certain questions about Matilal's approach, I'm not, sort of defending a kind of closed, attitude to pursuit of Indian philosophy. Okay. But my point is that we should be liberal. We should open ourselves to ideas and thoughts coming from entire human race. But at the same time, while engaging with these ideas, we should be more philosophically more cautious, more sort of rooted, so to say, so that we can really engage with those ideas. Otherwise, what would happen, and what has happened in many cases, is just kind of mimicking, kind of repeating some of those ideas. Okay, that is not going to do any good for philosophy. Okay. I mean, as Professor Chakraborty has mentioned, I'm again and again reminded of K.C. Bhattacharya. He really sort of internalizes, appropriates some of the ideas, okay, from Kant, from a bit of Hegel, okay, and he sort of grounds them. He sort of refines them, reformulates them, okay, in terms of his exposure to different Indian philosophical ideas. And I think that's one of the reasons why K.C. Bhattacharya succeeded, in making an original contribution to Indian philosophy. And K.C. Bhattacharya's philosophy is not Indian philosophy in traditional sense. It is philosophy, but there he appropriates, he brings in, he sort of assimilates ideas, from different philosophers from different traditions. So that is something, I think we should really work after.
Thank you, sir.
Does anybody have any question? So, okay. So let us conclude this session. We are immensely grateful to you, Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty, for presenting your work, and it was really enjoyable session. I'll request Amritonath to convey his vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakraborty. Thank you so much, Nilambar, for moderating this event. We are very, very grateful to you for accepting our invitation and delivering the lecture. It was really very warm, and I can't even thank you enough for that. We just have started our initiative, and it's still working very slowly, and your support was we are really very grateful for that. For other participants who have joined us today, I would like to inform you that on 17th of May, we have another session of our another series of event titled Authors in Conversation. And there we will have Professor Dan Zahavi speaking on his book, Being We. So please do register for that event. Your registration is mandatory for the certificate. Without that, you won't be able to download your certificate. So it's really a mandatory one. And thank you so much for joining us today. We wish you a very good evening ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Chakraborty.
Thank you,
participants, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.